We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice.
What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Gushel.
All right. It is Wednesday, March 6th, 2024. And we talked about starting a mini series of things to look forward to in the upcoming spring seasons, politically, geopolitically, societal-wise, etc. And I know some people might be thinking, well, spring doesn't start for a couple more weeks officially, at least here in the West. But it's already unseasonably warm here this winter, so it feels kind of apropos to begin to do a spring geopolitical outlook preview. So what we'd like to do is just evaluate and take a look at and talk about a few things that I guess we're going to be looking out for as far as trends that are going on, some of the combination of some of the events that are taking place right now, and then and kind of maybe giving an outlook or potential of what's going to be down the pike coming up. So that way also, if we miss individual events, like as far as there are important individual events that might pop up in the timeline of events that we might not immediately cover, but in the case of that, like just given a general layout, just could potentially cover a lot of these events. And so we're just going to focus in on a few things that we are paying attention to going into the spring season. And as usual, a lot of it will center around things that we have had our permanent focus on for a while here. But as far as the specifics go for the spring portion of this very unprecedented, uncharted waters as far as the American political scene that we continue to find ourselves in here in terms of the former president, now once again officially the Republican nominee, and of course Joe Biden and everything that surrounds that. And so I guess let's get into it, and we'll just we'll start here, probably go about 50 minutes to an hour, and start with just looking at some things that we are going to have our eyes on in the upcoming season here.
That sounds very apropos, Greg, because we did make it through here in the radical middle of America, in the Midwest, through a major cold spell for a while with a lot of snow and some ice. And then, as you pointed out, it got unseasonably warm, where it even reached 80 degrees down here in Lawrence, Kansas in the last week. And so there are anticipations of spring, and spring comes along with the regrowing of light and a sense of hope and the rebirth of life, of course, in terms of the landscape. At the same time, we know from history that spring is also the time when the more diabolical plotters tend to launch their operations. For example, the war in Iraq, I believe, launched on the first day of spring in 2003. So there are these indications that there are folks who are monger and rumors of war and the manufacturing of war, whether it's synthetic, hybrid warfare, invisible warfare, informational warfare, or kinetic warfare, or the guise of kinetic warfare in terms of Israel's continuing assault on the Palestinians in Gaza, that we need to keep our eyes open to as the spring gets going here. And there is a lot going on in the United States. For example, now maybe we could just jump into this, especially with the intensifying of the question of Israel and Palestine. And I even saw Ralph Nader has recently published a brief analysis asserting that the casualty numbers amongst Palestinians in Gaza under the Israeli assault are way underestimated. And this begins to make sense to me because this, once again, is these false dialectics that are set up between Netanyahu and Hamas in many ways. And so in this case, it's always the Israelis and the Israeli partisans and the propaganda network that services them worldwide always reject even these lower numbers because they say it's the Hamas, ministry who are giving these numbers. But meanwhile, it looks like there is a very conservative approach to the Palestinian numbers, these mortality numbers. Now, we can get caught up in, I think, problems of turning individual life into numbers, but numbers are important in terms of assessing things like just cause or what is the actual purpose of what Israel's doing. Is it really a quote unquote military response to the October 7th attacks, or is this something else in the realm with a genocidal intent, a Nakba 2.0? These kinds of questions do come into focus when you deal with the actual on the ground results. So that's something to look at. Is Nader is basically saying that the Gazan health ministries are way more conservative because they will only identify the dead who they can identify by name. And it makes sense that the numbers of about 30,000 dead, 70,000 injured, that's 100,000 casualties, are potentially multiples underestimated, putting this at what probably the single worst humanitarian assault and atrocities that we've seen in terms of rapidity and intensity, and not only the bombing but also the siege and the attempt to keep out humanitarian aid. We saw in the last week the flower massacre, as it's being called now, where it begins to really look like that Israel actually set up the Palestinians in terms of helping bring in a truck, and then as people are beginning to head towards starvation in Gaza, people are running to the truck, and there's then a mob, they say, and then they shoot, and many are killed and many more are injured. So this is all going down, and now we've seen the first, I think, public assertion that it's time for at least a ceasefire. We saw Vice President Kamala Harris say those words for the first time, saying it's time for it right now. Now, obviously, there's the question of Ramadan and the question of the hostages, which, as we've pointed out since right after October 7th, the hostages were not the point for the Netanyahu regime. They actually very likely were to be seen as, similarly to the Israeli casualties on October 7th, as sacrifices to the interests of the Iron Calf cult security state of Israel under things like the Hannibal Directive. We saw mass Hannibal deployed on October 7th in terms of Israeli military actually participating in what ultimately was the killing of their own citizens. And we also saw something like then Masada, like a Masada imperative, where there was an assault and an abusive relationship to the Israeli families of the hostages, where they were being told that's not what's that's not the crucial thing here. The crucial thing is our operation in Gaza, Hamas, eliminate Amalek, all of that kind of thing. So along with that, now we're seeing actions by the U.S. government that I would say even then would say that the U.S. government has now joined the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, that the Israeli partisans and the Ministry of Strategic Affairs have been leading a seditious assault nationwide in the United States in terms of the First Amendment, where dozens of states have passed these anti-boycott, divestment, sanction laws. And now, just in the last day, the U.S. Treasury has begun to pull out some of its big guns. The Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, has basically gone right to the top, to me, it looks like, in terms of beginning to sanction Israeli military intelligence, corporate cyber weapons operators. And so this is one of the things that is beginning to bubble here. Now, we've talked about how there were these much more sort of seemingly delicate approaches by the U.S. government and the Biden administration in terms of questions of diamonds and putting controls around the diamond markets. And as I pointed out, the diamond market in Israel is a crucial. It's sort of like the diamonds are like the oil. Like if Saudi Arabia is an oil state in terms of export, then Israel is a diamond state, a cyber weapons and diamond state, basically, in terms of export. And as we'll get into a little bit later, where there was another Department of Justice action against a Russian-Israeli intelligence operative, it looks like, named Alexander Smirnov, that a lot of this hooks back into this infamous 1995 Tel Aviv meeting that actually took place in the Diamond District of Tel Aviv in terms of the consolidation of the Russian-Israeli global mafia. The Semyon Mogilevich group, Boris Bierstein. A lot of this hooks right back into Ukraine and specifically the Russian deep state and organized crime syndicates, control over Ukrainian politics and economics that really began intensely after the fall of the Soviet Union. But I just want to just briefly lay out some of the details of this Treasury action of the Foreign Assets Control, Office of Foreign Assets Control. Then this is against Tal Dilian. As with a lot of these Israeli operatives, he has different names, actually. So you'll find that he has different first names and all of that. And then it's also the other individual is Sarah Alexandra Faisal Hamu, who is basically Tal Dilian's corporate cutout, shell company, corporation expert. And a lot of this is running out of the Cyprus geography. And as we pointed out early on in the Trump years, that there was a strong Cyprus locus. If there were two main loci in terms of the Russian-Israeli deep state operations, one was Hungary, Budapest, the Budapest Bridge, in terms of human intelligence. And then we identified Cyprus as the corporate cyber financial intelligence operations. And so this is hooking right into the middle of that, and also including Greece. And this is,
right.
Go for it.
Wilbur Ross, who a generation or so ago handled Trump's bankruptcies back in the early 90s, had a major foothold in Cyprus, the Treasury Secretary, among other people. So,
and remember Eric Schmidt, the adult, the quote unquote adult they brought in to Google to manage the co-founders of Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who was the CEO for many years, Eric Schmidt, who then in the recent years wrote a book, co-authored in a similar kind of way where Michael Flynn co-authored his book in the run-up to the 2016 campaign with arch neocon Michael Ledeen. Eric Schmidt wrote his book about the rise of artificial intelligence with then not late Henry Kissinger. And Schmidt had been pursuing, I don't know if he's acquired this, but he was pursuing Cyprus citizenship. So that you'll even go see that even the background of some of these other companies. Now this is it's called Intellexa, is the Tal Dilian consortium that is a consortium of many different kinds of cyber weapons that have been distributed and deployed around the world, including against American officials, which is why the Treasury Department is now directly acting upon this. And Dilian actually has an interesting background. He's actually an Israeli military intelligence officer, and actually he was the head of Unit 81, which is one of the more secret units in the Israeli military. It seems to be hooked in with Unit 8200, the Israeli NSA, which is now, over the last years, become notorious after really starting out just in the early Trump years. Almost no one had even knew the name Unit 8200 until we started bringing some of that to the table. And so now this is well known, and Unit 8200 has this technology offshoot basically called Unit 81. Very old unit, actually. And to me, it seems like it operates in between something like the Tal Dilian program, which is technological, corporate, academic, science, special forces, including long-term corporate espionage and penetration, really, of the American Silicon Valley, but also Silicon Valleys worldwide in many ways. And Unit 8200, where a lot of these cyber weapons productions come out of. And one last thing is that Tal Dilian was the head of Unit 81 for the years surrounding September 11th. So a parallel to me is if we have just seen in some ways something like the U.S. Treasury sanctioning the former head of Mossad or something like that on September 11th, Ephraim Halevi, who we've gone over his deep background, hooked into James Jesus Angleton way back, and he was the head of Mossad on September 11th. Now, this guy, Tal Dilian, was the head of Unit 81, their cyber technology special operations unit. And by the way, one of the key things that they're responsible for, Unit 81, is making sure that one of the other key special forces in the Israeli military that we've honed in on, especially in me actually asserting that October 7th and the entire operation media-wise and the quote-unquote response to it can be seen as a Sayeret Matkal cell operation. That is one of the key things that Unit 81 does, is make sure that Sayeret Matkal, black ops behind enemy lines, Netanyahu, Ehud Barak, Naftali Bennett, the head of the general chief of staff of the Israeli military, Herzl Halevi, all of them Sayeret Matkal, and Unit 81 makes sure that Sayeret Matkal has the technology and tool set that it needs to do its block operations behind quote-unquote enemy lines. And so this is the guy who is making sure that, I would say maybe we could even look at September 11th as a Sayeret Matkal operation. So this guy, I think, is in the middle of a lot of this stuff. So this is a big move by the U.S. government.
And all of those names you mentioned there of Netanyahu, Ehud Barak, Naftali Bennett, these are probably, there's a couple of other names in there, but these are the people who have been the faces of. I think that the I think there's been, and then there was one other one, Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister of Jerusalem, who was in New York on September 11th, who recently was encouraging Biden to make a speech to the Knesset to lay out why two states are necessary. And of course, we have our opinions about a two-state solution and all this, but I mean that was an interesting step. But outside of Olmert, you've got Netanyahu, Barak, and Bennett. Those are the three. Other than Olmert, those are the three prime ministers that Israel's had in the last, I think, since 1996. And so this is pretty. I'd say this is a pretty significant step, and it's interesting because we've been trying to balance the nuances of this situation because it's not as cut and dry or as black and white as some people would like to make it out to be. Maybe some people in a certain community that we're going to talk about later on in this little series we're doing here, the Russophilic community, for example. But that it's way more nuanced than just simply what's going on with the current administration and with I think the U.S. government and foreign policy community in general. Because we were seeing some trends, as you mentioned, pre-October 7th, but now that the immediate aftermath of October 7th, as far as like is we've gone on about 5-6 months since then, and as we've established that prior to October 7th, you had this. There were these things in place all the way from. We were identifying with certainly the relationship between the U.S. and certainly the Netanyahu elements of the Israeli government becoming colder and colder, I think, as time went on. And now we're starting to see, as you said, some moves being made again that we're kind of going into this pre-October 7th milieu between the time period, between the elements of the American establishment that are not, certainly not comfortable with things that are taking place right now, much less the long-term projects of the hardliners who just want to just have free reign to do whatever they please throughout the Palestinian territories and beyond. And I think we're starting to see that now come back into the forefront now that the immediate aftermath of October 7th out of the way. And it's interesting, like once again, like this is just another example of obviously I think that the existence of this very powerful Israel lobby with its economic and media assets has been probably the primary factor in keeping from a more a different response right from the outset. As far as we've been talking about this for so long, and the everything from the lack of a sufficient response, to say the least, to the ongoing slaughter, to other dynamics. But now it does seem that we're starting to move in a direction. And maybe, Jeremy, it's because of what you were telling me the other day, that this whole combination of the bear hug approach towards Netanyahu kind of fell flat, it seems like. And then also there seemed to be an attempt to try to embrace Saudi Arabia as well and bring them back. And now you've mentioned that now the manipulation of oil prices is beginning again via Saudi Arabia and Russia and the ramp up to the 2024 elections. There could also be maybe a bit of an understanding here that these approaches of like trying to, the combination of bear hugging Netanyahu and trying to appeal to these other regimes that were very much the beneficiaries of the Trump 11/9 operation, as we call it, that is now a different tact has to be taken. That was kind of the sense I've gotten almost, is that now we've got to move with a different tact now, that these efforts to try to use like this, I don't know, whatever this carrot and stick of love and flattery towards Netanyahu failed. Now we're going to start to utilize our abilities again. There of course is still the thing also that we identified of the ongoing efforts as far as from Britain to establish a Palestinian state. So these are all trends to look forward to, and this sanctioning is potentially a big part of this. Something to see how this continues to develop here throughout the spring season.
Yes, this is the David Cameron, Biden-Harris apparent alignment in terms of who's the GD superpower here, in terms of the Clinton phrase, in terms of dealing with Israel and Netanyahu specifically, are apparently beginning to slowly get into gear. decades and decades and decades of the United States very intensely captured and occupied by Israeli partisans and Zionist forces at all levels and different verticals in terms of the American government, corporations, media, society, and all of that. I'm even reminded of the whole celebrating Israeli military intelligence, urban moving systems, and others, classic moving systems groups. Who one of them at the urban moving systems office had told a coworker, "Give us 20 years." And we'll take over your entire media, something like that. Now, of course, people were like, I thought we already had a totally Zionist media, and they're partially correct about that. But this is actually an Israeli military intelligence threat against the American media, I think, that I'm reminded of.
But then we've also talked about like the even things like when I hear this, and I don't want to take you off your point, Jeremy. When I hear this, um, I think of things like what you identified as the Death Star, the 2016 campaign, Breitbart, Made in America, Conceived in Israel, and outlets like that. You can even obviously in some of these other outlets that have risen up to be these top, quote unquote, alt media, new media types of operations, like obviously the Daily Wire, for example. But I go back to thinking about like the 20 years from now, and then the rise of the new media that made 11/9 and Trump possible, and this whole Breitbart, Gateway, Pundit type of milieu and all of the offshoots. That's what I think about, even more so than like the traditional, what they call Zog media in some circles, which would be basically the traditional media networks and magazines and papers and all of that.
Yeah. So there is this sense of the Americans and the British being like, well, we've allowed Israel's lawyers, maybe Dennis Ross, in the American context, sort of run the quote unquote peace process for decades and decades and decades, all really in service of the Israeli side of things. And that it was the Israelis who could give the Palestinians a state or a statelet or a smart city corridor. If it's Jared Kushner on Lex Friedman's show talking about we were going to give the Israelis a state and all of that kind of thing. And he was really talking about how he and his partners in the Middle East, in Israel and Saudi Arabia, were going to give the Palestinians a state. And now it's more like that some of the superpowers in the West, the United States and the UK, are going to diplomatically recognize directly a Palestinian state, and with all of the diplomatic considerations surrounding that. Now, of course, as you mentioned before, we're suspicious of the quote unquote two-state solution as very likely. At the very least, it was used as the carrot for a fraudulent, multi-decade long, quote unquote, peace process that really always seemed to lead to more and more death and destruction, not some kind of two-state solution. However, if this were not being managed by the Israelis, but actually the most powerful country in the world directly recognizing the Palestinian state, this could then head in the direction of something that would eventually look like what I imagine that a real deeper solution would look like. And this makes so much sense for everyone of good faith involved. Like even the Israelis who take their, national security seriously. Can you imagine how you would just take almost that entire question off the table in terms of any foreign threats if you actually had a real binational state apparatus that included the Palestinians at the highest levels of security? There would be no, and of course, I believe that is the reason why the Netanyahu types will not only shrug off a two-state solution, but will call a one-state binational solution anti-Semitic, nut job, pie in the sky, that could never happen kind of scenario. So this is a big moment, I think, as things begin to evolve. And I think you're correct that in terms of the way that the parts of the U.S. government are beginning to move, and the Biden administration specifically are beginning to move, there is a sense of self-preservation that is hitting there. That their previous back end, or their upside down approach, as we pointed out, in terms of attempting to recapture the Abraham Accords with, and then eventually get to the question of the Palestinians who had been thrown under the bus, if you're talking about the Arab leaders, or transcended if you're talking about the clean break Netanyahu types in terms of the proposed Kushner plan and the Abraham Accords. That did not work. That did not work. That actually ended up, I believe, in very likely creating the terrain for which October 7th and the entire operation surrounding October 7th to then be deployed in an ongoing deadly manner. So there is, and then that is then coupled with what you talked about the bear hug approach to Netanyahu, with the hug of the Israeli people. And I imagine that the realists inside of the U.S. government and in the Biden administration now see that has been lost, that effort has been lost. The Israeli people have been in large part captured by their post 9/11 Israeli 9/11 zeitgeist, and they are the hug by Biden did not prevent that from happening. And this is why my sense has always been, if you're not going to incorporate the origins of these major terrorist operations from 9/11 to Israel's 9/11, then you are not going to be able to root out the consequential response, the deep human response to these kinds of things, where it activates a hindbrain in a very severe manner. And the hindbrain should be activated. But the question is, against who? Against whom and against what, in terms of the forces that actually threaten you? And of course, these kinds of operations, 9/11, the Simchat Torah terror treason operation, deployed on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War and Putin's birthday, with all kinds of security stand-downs that point to the highest levels of the Netanyahu regime being responsible for facilitating it, that these kinds of operations are meant to activate the hindbrain. And so if you can't muster the public will and courage to point at who actually did it and why, especially the biggest threat, human beings have always known that the biggest threats are not often from without, but they're from within. If you have a traitor, if you have someone who's willing to murder your own for political reasons, for self-aggrandizing reasons, or whatever, if we wanted to put a Steve Pachenik spin on it, then you are not willing to face not only the most morally consequential threat against the hindbrain, but you're also not strategically going to be able to accomplish your humanistic and moral intent in terms of the ceasefire, or ending the endless wars and the war on terror and all of that. It's not going to work like that. You have to root out the treason and the traitors at the top. You have to expose it. And so obviously the Biden administration has realized that their delicate approach to bear hugging Netanyahu and embracing the Israeli public at this point is definitely not working, if not having fully failed. So there's another approach here going on. And so I just want to finish up, maybe before we move on, Greg. You brought up the Russophile multipolar conference that's going on right now, and that will tie into some of these other geopolitical forces that are spotlighted in terms of U.S., UK, Israel, Palestine. But just a couple last things here in terms of, you pointed out that there was, before October 7th, there were these indicators and certain moves by the U.S. government in this sector. For example, in late 2021, the first year of the Biden administration, I think it was in November, they announced a ban on things like the Pegasus, NSO Pegasus. And by the way, that's what I was going to say before, is NSO Pegasus, the so the archetype of Israeli cyber weapons that we know were used against people like, very likely, Jeff Bezos at Amazon, uh, Khashoggi, in terms of setting him up to be hacked up. That this company, NSO, it had umbrella corporations that had very interesting apparent Russian ties via Cyprus. So this is really an epicenter here. And Dilian, Tal Dilian, this former commander of Unit 81 in Israeli military intelligence, his big product is called Predator spyware. And maybe what I'll do is I'll include a link to an interview that I did with Jonathan Geyer, who's a journalist and editor from the DC area, that I did in maybe late summer of 2021, surrounding certain aspects of the Biden administration in terms of their connections to some of these Israeli spyware and other Israeli technology companies, including where we talked a bit about the relationship between Raytheon and Raphael, which has come into further focus now. And people should go look at John Swynn's Expose the Enemy channel. He did some interesting and elucidating productions around the bombs that are being used in Gaza, that are being supplied by the United States, much being produced by Raphael and Raytheon in conjunction, and so there's there's a deep background here in terms of this being an escalation of what was actually done in 2021 by the Biden administration in terms of the Pegasus software. Now this is really this is a sanctioning. This is the Treasury. So I welcome aboard the U.S. government and the Treasury Department into the global boycott, divestment, sanctions movement.
Wow, and yes, I definitely concur with that. And now it seems like maybe there's some people who are realizing that and they won't say it publicly, as you said, Jeremy. The gloves are not going to come off like they really need to when it comes to this whole matter of Israel and of the real serious seditious Zionist elements. But they're starting to realize that maybe the David Rothkopfs weren't incorrect in like the way that they're saying that Israel has to be dealt with, or Netanyahu and the interests around Netanyahu and the types of elements of the Israeli military and other sectors that he comes out of, and the way they need to be dealt with, or among other things. So it's we'll see where this goes, but this is certainly an interesting development. Interesting would be an understatement. And I wanted to add on to this, Jeremy, that I was thinking about this. So I'm kind of, as I always do, I'm thinking about this. I'm saying it out loud as I think about it, but I wonder if this is in part, and I think this is, but we've been seeing this effort that was in place, obviously driven by the Trump forces, and the forces that have really represent this complete, I would say, takeover of the Republican Party, of GOP politics, of Congress, particularly within the Republican Party, to kill this bill that would have covered simultaneously Ukraine, Israel, and and actually it appears maybe really tried to put some kind of effort to actually deal with what's going on at the U.S. Mexico border in a serious manner. Actually, try to deal with the problem by forces that just want to obstruct and want to keep actually the effective governance of this in order to keep alive these issues that are going to hopefully to propel Donald Trump back into office, maybe even through a lack of a solution or a lack of an actual push for a solution, could lead to something like some type of, heaven forbid, terrorism involving some forces or elements or another. Because there's now the threat of jihadists at the border has been put back in the narrative big time, along with these Chinese and all this. So there's the now the conglomeration of all of the traditional threats of like the terror hawks are now merging and all coming over at the border, and we don't know who's coming in, so anything can happen. So, but what I'm getting at is that I wonder if this response here is, or in a way, is this also a reaction to efforts for like diplomacy and for some type of like traditional foreign policy as it relates to Ukraine, but even also to Israel, where it's like I think this was just going to be in the realm of the more traditional aspects of aid to Israel as it goes. And of course, once again, much like the two-state solution, we could talk about the problems with that. But even something like this in a way to try to deal with these crises, the combination of domestic and international crises in somewhat of like a more traditional American political sense, was completely dismantled and stifled and basically was effectively done away with, thanks to this whole MAGA pushing and these politicians who were completely captured in the Senate. And I mentioned to you, Laura Ingraham basically threatening Mike Johnson with a phone call from Donald Trump when she interviewed him on Fox, right before he first publicly came out with his opposition to what was being really in a strong manner, what was being presented as far as for the border, bipartisan border national security foreign aid bill. And so I think there's part of this here that has to be seen as a response to this, like maybe, and this also, remember, we've been talking about just how much of a hit Biden's taken. You mentioned self-preservation, like he's really taken a hit with the response or lack thereof response with the American community, and a lot of Democrats and progressives are very, very dissatisfied, to say the least, with the lack of response to what's been happening since October 7th, or lack of sufficient response. And so it's just the attempt to try to do a real political, try to once again really push like a serious type of combination of a pushback against these combined like Trump, Russian, Netanyahu forces that are conglomerated together to destroy this attempt to try and do something about these respective crises to at least somewhat of a potentially effective manner, combined with also wanting to reestablish like the American political muscle, who's the GD superpower here, and try to actually really come through with a breakthrough before the 2024 election. I see these things also possibly or likely being at play here with the combination of once again going back to the combination of the rejection of the Biden bear hug attempt towards the Netanyahu, and then also these obstructionists, these destroy the administrative state types, the chaos types who just want to take advantage of border chaos to reinstall the Donald Trump regime back into place. I think that all of these might be at play here.
All right, so these are some very important political points that you've made here, Greg, and I would like to further delve into that and the intersection between the domestic politics and then these geopolitics and how they interface to finish up maybe in our last 15 to 20 minutes. But before we leave the question of Israel-Palestine more generally, I just want to touch on the protest, the self-immolation protest by the United States Airman Aaron Bushnell, which took place in the last couple weeks, where he very calmly and consciously, on recording himself on video, said that he was about to do an extreme form of protest, and then set himself on fire on video in front of the Israeli embassy, and specifically saying that he refused to be part of the American support for the Israeli genocide on the Palestinian people. And so this is obviously a major protest move, and it's also galvanizing all kinds of different responses. And you seem to have, the the pro-Palestinian side has fully embraced the act as an act of great courage, like Cornel West has called it. And then the pro-Israel side in general, these are rough estimates of these sides, have seemed to want to point to that this is potentially even on the edge of terrorism, some people have said. Others have said this is mental illness, or this is, setting a crisis of American manhood, setting oneself on fire in support of Hamas. Hamas's rape and
I wokeness out of control. Yeah.
and I would say that there's a fuller complexity. I think that it requires response in terms of this kind of act, because in a certain way, I would say that this is the first public example that we have of a member of the U.S. military, in this case, the U.S. Air Force, actually consciously and publicly saying that they're willing to die and dying on behalf of quote unquote wars for Israel. Now, this is a symbolic demonstration against that, right? But it's still in many ways this very public act to say, I'm unwilling to kill on behalf of an American war on behalf of Israel or something like that. But I'm willing to die to say that I oppose it. So, and the reason this is important that he's an airman too, because if you think about the symbology of that, it's the air forces. Think about the Israeli air forces raining down bombs from on high, where they don't look they're not even on the same plane as the people that they are killing in terms of the military actions. And so this is I think there's something very deep about the symbology of an airman setting himself on fire, basically saying this is what our people, Air Force, U.S. Air Force support for Israeli Air Force, are doing to human beings on the ground, and putting that on full display. Now, there's a certain directness around this that, to me, almost exposes what's maybe some of the Jewish Voice for Peace groups have done in terms of their civil disobedience. That in certain ways, I strategically more agree with the Jewish Voice for Peace tactics in many ways. However, the notorious absence of their ability to actually target for civil disobedience structures of Jewish power, Israeli power. Aaron Bushnell said, no, I'm doing that. He didn't go and do it in the middle of a street during rush hour. He didn't do it in front of a train station. No, he went to the sidewalk in front of the Israeli embassy and did this. Meanwhile, critically, I'd say, although there was obviously a strong commitment to justice and morality in terms of his statement, he continued to yell out, "Free Palestine, free Palestine, free Palestine," while he was burning up, until he just physically could not do it and then collapsed. However, there was a virtual absence of what I would say is the truth function. Now, people will say he called it a genocide. So that's a truth function, but that's not really a truth function. That's a legal term. That's international law. And so once again, I believe that the thing that is people are most cowardly, even people who obviously have a great amount of physical courage, even a willingness to sacrifice their own life in this case, that one of the areas where human beings in general, because of our deep social evolution and background, and we've talked about this before over many years, one of the key areas where we tend to fall short is in social courage. And that includes in being able to first understand truths that are difficult, and then to speak truths that are unpopular, even amongst what we see as our own movements of association or agreement and that kind of thing. And so I would just point out that I still believe that although this act should not be dismissed as as terrorism or as crazy or as retrograde or as anti-productive or these kinds of things, I do think it is it ends up being an evasion of the higher level of courage than physical courage. Because we pointed out before, military people are willing to serve in the military, especially in the United States, where it's not like Israel where you're required. But in the United States where you volunteer, that there's a high level of physical courage that is implied by just that single action. However, if you go look at the oath, and this is my other criticism, I would say, of this act and other kinds of acts like this, that even the oath that Bushnell, I imagine, took in order to become a U.S. airman, the oath is to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and then additionally to follow all orders if they are lawful. And so, although this was obviously a conscious, moral, humanitarian act that Bushnell took, he didn't actually fulfill his oath. And how one fulfills one's oath is difficult to consider. But I would, again, in terms of the question of October 7th and the genocide in Gaza, or 9/11 and the endless wars, we need to pursue it to its root. That means speaking truths, facts, and analysis in uncomfortable spaces, which might even include amongst people that we believe are and really are our allies and or associates. And so once again, I'll say that I've actually seen that the boycott, divestment, sanction people, I believe, are in many ways strategically beginning to lead the way in terms of public action, where they have facts that they bring to the table in terms of the actual backing of certain organizations, whether it's American military contractors, or I saw one where a BDS supporters who were law students were grilling lawyers from the what's that firm from New York City that we've identified for many years as the key, actually, Israeli technology legal front firm. Um, Sheila Birnbaum from there, Kenneth Bialkin,
Let me think for a second.
former
Scanner.
Skadden Arps. Thank you, Skadden Arps. I saw an action by the boycott, divestment, sanctions people who grilled them with in questions and statements with facts. So to me, these kinds of things are actually leading the way when combined with the obvious moral commitment and physical courage commitment of someone like an Aaron Bushnell, that actually lead in the direction of both short to long-term moral success. And as we pointed out, and I'll finish with this, it's not good enough to say that you act with moral intent. That's my whole long-term beef with these key elements, I think, of the impotent left, like the Chris Hedges types, who I see sort of like wringing hands and almost in a theological fashion and justifying impotent potential actions theologically by saying, well, it's good enough that we will be seen by our God and history to have done something against this. That is not good enough. If you're really morally committed, then there is a strategic nature that you have to consider in terms of the actual nature of your actions. We have to be successful in figuring out how to meet our moral ends, our ethical ends. If we fail in both the short to long term, then does it really matter in the ultimate end, both in God's eyes and in like future history's eyes, that we did something rather than nothing? No, we have to figure out what will actually work. So that's my long-winded approach to like acknowledging the extreme moral commitment and physical bravery of someone like Aaron Bushnell in relationship to his action, while also taking it seriously enough to consider whether those kinds of actions are really what it will take in terms of where we really need to get, even purely in an ethical fashion.
Well, thank you for that. I think this is a great conversation for a much more extended program, going into like some of the serious, really like a deep dive into some of these matters that you just brought up and mentioned here. And I guess I'll say from my vantage point that we're all human. We've all fallen short in many ways when it comes to these things, and none of us are immune from that. And I guess for me personally, I'm never going to be the face of physical courage. I realize that, and this is widespread. This does not reflect upon Bushnell or anybody else in particular in any way, shape, or form. But there's a lot of people out there who are very physically courageous, much more physically courageous than myself, who I would also classify are not morally at the level anywhere where they need to be when it comes to like having a moral courage to go along with that physical courage. Now there are exceptions, of course, but there is this, and this is part of like this macho masculine culture that's being built up. And I mean, I don't know, not to say that like this is represented here. This is something entirely different from like the Bushnell situation, I think. But I just think about like this whole idea of physical and moral courage, and you have this idea like the warrior, the physical courage, and all this. But these people in these circles, I think that I'm talking about, like your MAGA super masculinity, they're a bunch of moral cowards when it comes down to it. I think, and that's my brief summary of that. And but I think though you're getting to something here, because there is a difference between doing an individual provocative act and then really like this like deep type of truth to power. And I would also say that something like this that is something that I couldn't even, something that you can't even like imagine or really even think about doing, the process of setting oneself on fire for a cause. It's also something though at a deep level. You talked about how like it played, there was this, it very much played into the contemporary ongoing culture wars that are going on. And I think also it plays into the hands of people who also do not possess the moral courage necessary to honestly deal with the state of affairs in Israel, Palestine, or elsewhere, into the whole circles of these, the Russophile conference and these types of communities. It plays into their hands of like this is heroic on the scale of like the Hamas heroes who punched the bully in the face on October 7th and all of this. And then that also goes into the narrative of Russia is going to help free the Palestinians, and the Russophile conference and Syrian girl coming together with all the Jackson Hinkles and Alexander Dugins, and I guess Lavrov is present, and Sergei Lavrov. So I see this in this bigger framing of, and this goes way beyond any Bushnell or any other individual, just this framing of moral and physical courage and political courage. And I just look at this as, I guess, a bigger societal framework of ultimately there is this whole false notion of what courage is, and it's all like this physical idea of what the warrior is with this pseudo macho masculine culture that we have. But then also real political courage is an antidote, so to speak. I think antidote, there's our name again, against like these people that are going to step in and take the role of authorities on these matters that they themselves are not going to lead to any type of honest or productive conclusions on.
Those are important considerations, Greg, and I agree that those really help frame the the double bind dialectic that we've seen rise, especially intensely after October 7th and the ongoing Israeli assault on Gaza. And it is very interesting that you see people like Norman Finkelstein being raised as, for the pro-Palestinian side, as a key expert, a key scholar on these things, where he is in many ways. He's done much of that work. But politically, where did he stand on? He was anti-boycott, divestment, sanctions, very publicly, actually, and butted heads with, like, what I would say are some of the actual more organic Palestinian intellectual and political leadership. And he seemed to quickly throw his lot in with Hamas after sort of, before then double checking himself after October 7th. Now, and then we see this all the way to the bickering between the gray zone versus the intercept about who was the actual origins of the debunking of the New York Times organized rape story that was run out of Israeli military operative. And yet nowhere in this sphere do you see people who are willing to publicly question the origins of these 9/11s. And so more and more I begin to see that yes, that it's in these areas of obvious discomfort, and where there are not easy answers or easy sides to taken away, that promise the possibility of political antidotes. And I continue to believe in the power of the rights and responsibilities that are protected under the First Amendment as crucial, not only to rooting out the wickedness, the treason, the war criminality at the highest levels, but also in terms of bolstering and reconstructing, in many ways, the best of the American political society as it's under escalating assault again by the clean break culture war types. And so we maybe, in finishing up here, Greg, we could just briefly go over what's going on in terms of the domestic politics, as you brought up before, as it's moving into this key political season in the United States, where I do think we're seeing something like a 2016 and 2020 on a combination of methamphetamine and fentanyl, really, at a very, very high level. And although we won't get into the implications of the Alexander Smirnov case this time, we will in the future, and that will help explain some of what is going on that is in very large part a repetition of what we saw in both 2016 and 2020. But I do want to just finish up that by saying that it does look like to me that there are these there's a troika, really, of political operations, or quote unquote issues, that are going to be used and are being currently used to wage war against the American body politic, specifically in relationship to the question of the election and the Biden v. Trump and the Biden administration currently. And one is obviously the weaponization of the border issue. It's very clear in terms of what you pointed out, in terms of Laura Ingraham acting as a stick wager against Mike Johnson, who has all kinds of other issues in the background. You found this very interesting podcast of Mike Johnson and Jim Jordan going to Israel years ago, which is very interesting. There's deep questions about Mike Johnson's background in terms of the religious rights relationship to culture war and a very Russian sphere over a long period of time, and then also just direct funding by Russian energy front companies in the United States in terms of Mike Johnson. And so Laura Ingraham basically threatening him with the Trump stick of, you better not take, what really is being said is, don't take this issue away from us. at this point. We
Right,
need
right.
this for this season. And so that's a big one. I think that's one of the troika that we're going to
And then
see.
that's where where you saw people, we identified this, I think, in our last recording, people like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio just like betraying their, their usual like political stances in the age of, and this is the other thing where I think it's changed. The age of the GOP has now just been just completely, with anyone who has any type of future political prospects within the GOP, completely taken over by these interests that the Civil War was waged over, that the MAGA types won the war over in 2016 and 2020. So
Yes. And so that's a culture war issue. That's the way it's being waged, as a culture war issue, the question of the border and immigration. Now there's the economic weaponization, the economic issue that is very clearly there's a ramp up here especially between the Saudis and the Russians. So Mohammed bin Salman and Putin are apparently already engaged in lowering production of oil, with Mohammed bin Salman being the most powerful of the OPEC leadership, and driving up prices of gasoline, right? That is a bread and butter issue. And these are the kinds of issues that singularly almost can be used to take down administrations. You can think of Jimmy Carter in many ways. Now, it's not always just a single issue, but it's a crucial one. And we saw this already happen 2018, the midterms. This same network that were involved in the 11/9 operation, people want to now say that that it's only Israel, it was only Netanyahu, and that any talk and deeper consideration of other Middle Eastern components or the Russian component is really just the Israelis running cover or blaming others for what they and almost they alone did. And it's not true. And so this is an area where you have the parts of the 11/9 conspiracy, the Red Sea conspiracy, that very much was run through Netanyahu's office, but also involved the highest levels of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and then on into the Kremlin and Putin in Russia. And they, in 2018, it looks like they worked to drive down oil prices, setting up Trump for a midterm success. 2022, they did the opposite, where they seemed to run it up. And all in the background here is that it was in the Trump years that a key oil refinery in the United States down in Texas was allowed to be sold, handed over to the Saudis. And so this is one other key piece. Watch for this thing that we saw some serious aspect of in the run up to 2022, of shortages, a potential trucker strike or trucker caravan kind of operation that is very
real quick,
reminiscent of Kissinger down in Chile.
this also reminds me of, remember the narrative that was pushed, diesel shortages and all that. We're going to run out of diesel fuel and trucks won't be able. And that might have been what you were getting at with the whole, like what you mentioned there with the trucks. But like I was thinking about that in this narrative that at the time, obviously they come to fruition of mass diesel shortages and we won't be able to get supplies across the country and all this. So
Exactly that. And then the third one, which will be the war and peace, or the geopolitical weapon in this troika of quote unquote issues, is of course Israel Palestine and the ongoing Israeli assault, and the deep support by the U.S. government of the ongoing attempted national genocide of the Palestinian people, with thousands and thousands, dozens of thousands of casualties of all sorts implicated, with genocidal intent expressed amongst many different officials in terms of the Israeli context. And so, as you'll see, as these Russophiles, as conference comes to a close in Russia, with all your, favorite alt media people who some of them even just sort of rise to major prominence after October 7th because they're alleged Palestinian solidarity activists such as Jackson Hinkle are all there together. Jackson Hinkle is riding on Russian tanks with infrared Haas, who appears to be the origins of the term MAGA communism. Syrian girl there. Dugin. Hinkle is sitting very close to Dugin and Malofeev.
Yes.
And these are the people who I would say who actually orchestrated the Ukrainian war way back, more than 10 years back. These are the people who orchestrated the Ukrainian war, the dirty war in the Donbass in relationship to the previous decade and more of political warfare and deep political operations in terms of Ukraine, in terms of the Russian deep state. And there they are. And then you have Syrian girl saying that Russia is going to be a key part of freeing Palestine. And meanwhile, the only, in terms of the great superpowers, Russia is almost nowhere to be seen in publicly, really, in terms of what they're doing in terms of Israel-Palestine. And China, where's China? The United States, obviously, rightfully so, has this Israeli genocidal policy hung around our neck because we've taken it on. Now we've discussed some things that are inklings of beginning to remove this and assert who the GD superpower is here, but we're not quite there yet. But there are inklings of that. And so as we begin to see, I think, these troika of issues being ramped up, we can discuss a little bit more of the deeper history, I think, of Israel-Palestine and the way that it was managed, not just by the United States in terms of being the key patron and the U.S.-Israel special relationship, which is a crucial piece of all of this, or the U.K. as being the originator of the mandate for Israel in terms of the Balfour Declaration and all of that history before they became a target of the Zionist terrorists who founded the Israeli state. But then the question of the long-term management of savagery, as Max Blumenthal might call it. But I would call it the strategy of tension, a management of the what's now called the Israel-Palestine conflict by the Eastern sphere, especially the Soviet sphere, in terms of deep penetration of quote-unquote both sides and leadership and intelligence, both sides of the Israel-Palestine conflict that is related to things that are known about, such as like Operation SIG, which is a active measures program, I think, by the Soviets, basically to hang the albatross of the Israeli state around the neck of the West in the United States, the quote-unquote main enemy of the KGB at the time, more generally. And so this is, there's a lot of deep geopolitics behind the moment where we're at now that I think we can use to further elucidate the forces and powers that are operating to continue to wage war and attempt to destabilize in a kind of political clean break program against the American body politic, especially, and we the people more generally worldwide.
Yes, I think that's a great way to summarize. And I think just about bringing into this, and I will just follow. My last point will be that I agree with you that where the actual multipolar like diplomas, the actual multipolar solutions are actually, I don't see where they're at. It's just certainly from a Russian component, it's taking this matter and using it basically, as you said, like an albatross around the neck of the Americans in the West, the evil Yankees, and it just ultimately it's just another fact. It's just another element that's used to destabilize, and you have that from both the right, quote unquote, and the left, quote unquote, the anti-war elements, whether it's the paleo conservative right or the anti-war left is very much in these Russian milieus, but then also even in the American milieu, as you said, like The Intercept, which is kind of on the opposite side of the gray zone, is also not willing to deal with the deep politics of things like the respective 9/11s and all of this. So that's definitely in play. But I think that it's much more of a means to used as like a further destabilizing factor, and that's where you see these things like the Russophile conference. I think is an extension of that legacy. And unless you have something else you want to say to follow up on that, I think we will probably wrap it up here.
Yeah, this sounds like a good place to wrap it up, and we will continue on with some of these investigations and some others that we may have or may not have mentioned in terms of what's going on into the future. And last thing I'll point out is that, sure, of course, like China and Russia have done what they've always done in terms of the UN, where they'll vote for the ceasefire, and the U.S. is there to veto the thing. And yet, meanwhile, you don't have Netanyahu, who very publicly at the APAC conference, probably 2018, made statements of like, there are those who will boycott us. We will boycott them. But meanwhile, you would think that like calling for a Palestinian state in a milquetoast fashion, as I guess the U.S., the U.K., Russia, and China continue to do in different ways, or the call for a ceasefire for what? For how long? And then resolved in what way? Are we going to get to the bottom of who all did October 7th in terms of this ongoing operation that was part and parcel of it? Is that part of the ceasefire? Are we going to have truth, justice, and real peace and dignity and freedom? I guess not, because Netanyahu is never calling publicly for boycotting China and Russia, as he rightfully should, if they're allegedly against what he says that he is, for, which is preventing a Palestinian state and preventing a ceasefire. So deep geopolitics go a little bit beyond what you see on the surface level, and we will further explore this in the days to weeks to come.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. And we'll get into some of those other matters we talked about, maybe dig some more into the Russia factor, and obviously the Smirnov indictment and what that might mean for the how that figures into the upcoming spring season politically, and then maybe some of the domestic issues specifically surrounding candidate Trump. But we'll get into all that hopefully next time. Thank you, Jeremy.
All right, thank you, Greg, and thank you, everybody. We appreciate you. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.